Cornwall, for fairly obvious reasons, has become something of a magnet for filmmakers, both professional and amateur. Thanks to those who recorded what they saw and those who have helped to preserve those records, we have a unique film archive that presents this opportunity to bring to life the Cornwall of old. The descriptions of many of the events featured are taken from the archives of the Western Morning News and the West Briton. For centuries, one of Cornwall's main industries and a mainstay of its economy was fishing. Of course, local people had always taken fish from the sea for their own consumption, but records of shipments of pilchards from Looe in the mid-16th century tell us that by then it was also a business. By the early 17th century, there were more than 2,000 seafaring men in Cornwall, and a survey in 1602 shows that the Cornish fishing industry was of national importance. By the 18th century, the fish market in Penzance was busy with merchants from far and wide and regular boats from London carrying away cured pilchards. The busiest harbours were St Ives, Padstow and Looe, but almost every coastal community had its small fishing fleet. One of the most common ways of catching pilchards in Cornwall was by seine fishing, a method that had barely changed since prehistoric times. A seine is a large fishing net hung vertically in the water and deployed from seine boats, which were broad in the beam and sharp in the bows. In the summer of 1850, Wilkie Collins, a Victorian novelist, visited St Ives and left a wonderful description of the whole process, from sighting the shoals to processing the pilchards. With the discovery of the first shoal, the active duties of the lookout on the cliffs begin. They are called hueurs, a word said to be derived from the old French verb huer, to call out, to give an alarm. On the vigilance and skill of the hueur much depends. He is, therefore, not only paid his guinea a week while he is on the watch, but receives a percentage of all the fish taken under his auspices. He is placed at his post, where he can command an uninterrupted view of the sea some days before the pilchards are expected to appear, and, at the same time, boats, nets, and men are all ready for action at a moment's notice. The principal boat is at least 15 tons in burden, and carries a large net called the seine, which measures nearly 400 yards in length and costs £170, sometimes more. It is simply one long strip, some 24 yards in breadth, composed of very small meshes and furnished all along its length with lead at one side and corks at the other. The men who cast this net are called the shooters and receive 11 shillings and sixpence a week and 1 basket of fish each out of every haul. As soon as the hueur discerns the first appearance of a shoal, he waves his bush. The signal is conveyed to the beach immediately by men and boys watching near him. The seine boat, accompanied by another small boat to assist in casting the net, is rowed out where he can see it. Then there is a pause, a hush of great expectation on all sides, until the shoal is thoroughly embayed in water which he knows to be within the depth of the seine net. Then, as the fish begin to pause in their progress and gradually crowd closer and closer together, he gives the signal. The boats come up and the seine net is cast, or, in the technical phrase, shot overboard. When it has been taken all round the fish, the 2 extremities are made fast, and the shoal is then imprisoned within an oblong barrier of network surrounding it on all sides. This labour completed, the silence of intense expectation that has hitherto prevailed among the spectators on the cliff is broken. The shoal is secured. Now the scene on shore and sea rises to a prodigious pitch of excitement. The merchants to whom the boats and nets belong, and by whom the men are employed, join the hewer on the cliff. All their friends follow them. Boys shout, dogs bark madly. Every little boat in the place puts off, crammed with idle spectators. Old men and women hobble down to the beach to wait for the news. The merchant forgets his dignity and joins them. The hewer, so calm and collected hitherto, loses his self-possession and waves his cap triumphantly. Even you and I, reader, uninitiated spectators though we are, catch the infection and cheer away with the rest, as if our bread depended on the event of the next few minutes. Hooray, hooray! Yo, hoy, hoy, hoy! Pull away, boys! Up she comes! Here they are! Here they are! The huge scale of the pilchard trade can be gleaned from an account by Philip Ball, a leading Cornish fish merchant. He refers to an enormous catch in Mevagissey Bay on a single night during the 1816 season, when 40 seine crews, around 700 fishermen, caught 12,000 hogsheads, almost 2,800 tons. By the mid-1750s, the number of pilchards shipped from the principal ports of Penzance, Foy, Falmouth and St Ives averaged 30,000 hogsheads each year. That's around 900 million fish. Philip Ball estimated that there were 3,000 to 4,000 pilchard fishermen in Cornwall. In addition, a successful catch would drain the countryside of people to carry the fish to the cellars, and each cellar would employ 15 to 20 women salting the fish. It's thought that up to 20,000 were employed directly in the industry. As well as pilchards, the seas around Cornwall were rich in herring and mackerel, and around 600 drifters and trawlers operated from Cornish harbours. For centuries, Cornwall's fishermen had adhered to a strict rule not to work on a Sunday. This was enforced under a bylaw passed in St Ives in 1622. It is agreed by general consent that henceforth no owners of boats or nets shall operate on the Sabbath. If any shall transgress, each owner shall pay 10 shillings, and each fisherman 3 shillings and 4pence, to be levied for the use of the parish. But not all fishermen played by the same rules, as the Western Morning News of the 6th of May, 1876 reveals. A fleet of about 30 boats from Lowestoft, Rye and Yarmouth came to St Ives this morning with their Sunday night catch of mackerel, amounting to thousands per boat. But the fishermen of St Ives do not approve of fishing on Sunday, and vast numbers of them assembled on the quay and prevented the landing of any fish. The wind and tide being favourable, the boats bore up for Hale, and thither the masters and others from St Ives followed, to prevent, if possible, any fish being landed there. The East Coast men, the Yorkies as they were known in Cornwall, were nothing if not persistent, and things came to a head in 1896 when a fleet from Lowestoft put into Newlyn one Monday morning, having fished all day Sunday. Locals were incensed, and fishermen from Newlyn and Portleven stormed the outsiders' boats and destroyed the catch. When a Lowestoft man protested, he was set upon by locals, which sparked off a running battle along the quayside. Penzance Borough Police were summoned, and a large number of special constables hastily sworn in. But as the violence escalated, the authorities telegraphed for a gunboat and troops. On Monday evening, a special train brought 350 men of the Royal Berkshire Regiment to Penzance, who marched to Newlyn, headed by 6 magistrates, to read the Riot Act. They were received with jeers and howls of derision as the troops took possession of the South Pier, clearing it of everyone save the Yorkies, who were ordered to leave at once with their boats. They sailed off, amid catcalls and insults from the assembled locals, just as HMS Ferret steamed into Mounts Bay and came by the harbour wall. Meanwhile, news of the disturbance had reached a large contingent of the St Ives fishing fleet, then at Scilly. They at once set sail for Newlyn and arrived on Tuesday evening with pennants flying, like an armada, to show their support for the Mount's Bay men. By Wednesday morning, things were a little calmer, and government officials were brought in to negotiate an agreement. The Fishermen's Committee then drew up a statement to the Home Secretary. From our great-grandfathers' days down to the present, it has been the custom of our port to refrain from fishing on the Saturday night and Sunday night. Lowestoft and Yarmouth men take advantage of this, contrary to the rules or customs of the port. Fish on the Saturday nights and Sunday nights, and, after being out several nights, make it a point of coming to market on Monday morning with their fish in a decomposed condition, swamp the market with these rotten fish, and so destroy the week's market. A month later, the Newlyn men met to consider a proposal from the Board of Trade that the East Coast men should refrain from fishing on Saturday nights. After a stormy session, it was agreed by a slender majority to accept the compromise, although local fishermen were divided into Sunday keepers and Sunday breakers, and flew pennants to identify which they were. While local fishermen fought hard to preserve religious rules, they weren't so fastidious in upholding certain other laws. The nature of Cornwall's coastline and its long seafaring tradition made it almost inevitable that smuggling should become a popular source of additional income. Smuggling reached a peak after the government increased duties on imported goods like tea, tobacco, wine and spirits to finance wars with France. Tea could be bought in Europe for 1/6 of the price in Britain and brandy 1/5 of the price, which meant that duty-free goods could be sold at knockdown prices and still produce a handsome profit for the smuggler. It's said that a labourer could earn more in one night carrying brandy barrels up from the beach than a month in the fields. Furthermore, to independent-minded Cornish folk, depriving the English government of revenue, far from being considered a crime, seemed like a jolly good idea. The claim that almost everyone in Cornwall, from the top of society to the bottom, was involved in some way with smuggling isn't too far from the truth. The fortune of the Killigrew family who established Falmouth was largely based on piracy and smuggling. A mayor of St Ives, John Nill, paid for the fitting out of a privateer which was used as a smuggling ship. John Nill was also the local customs collector. But pride of place among Cornwall's smuggling hierarchy must go to Zephaniah Job of Polperro. He put the local free trade operation on a sound financial footing, ran a number of vessels out of Polperro, organised cargoes from Guernsey, hired lawyers for any of his men who were arrested, and made a fortune. In the process, he built the town's first school, repaired its harbour, and brought previously unheard-of prosperity to the little town. One beneficiary of Zephaniah Job's operations was a character known as Battling Billy, who ran the Halfway House Inn. According to legend, he used a hearse to carry contraband from a remote cove to the inn. One day, while brandy was being loaded in broad daylight, the revenue arrived. Billy was shot in the neck and killed instantly, but his whip hand continued to urge the horses on. When they reached Polperro, the dead man drove straight down the main street, off the quayside, and into the harbour. Battling Billy's ghost is said to haunt the narrow cobbled streets. There are many other colourful tales involving the cat-and-mouse struggle between the smugglers and the customs men. On one occasion, a smuggler was bringing brandy ashore when the cargo was captured by a government brig. When the news spread, locals raided an armoury at Tranance and opened fire on the brig in the bay until the cargo was returned. Other methods of evasion were a little more subtle. The landlord at the Blue Bell in St Ives paid the full duty on one keg of brandy and always had the receipt at hand. The keg lasted for 22 years. The smugglers of Falmouth operated on an extraordinary scale. Newspaper reports for 24th of May 1839 tell of a schooner loaded with coal docking in Falmouth harbour. A suspicious customs officer bored holes in the hull with a gimlet and received a faceful of brandy from a tub stowed in a secret cavity. Altogether there were 276 barrels of brandy and gin in the space. The ship had been operating for 3 years without detection. In many ways, the customs men were fighting a losing battle, and this description shows just one aspect of their impossible task. When you enter the two little towns of East and West Looe, you find the houses run straggling out toward the sea. The number of turnings and windings and hiding places is astonishing. Now down steps, now up steps, now by doors in the front, then by doors in the back, and again by doors in the sides, and lastly by doors from the water. Woe to the unlucky revenue officer who was lost among these traps at night without a lamp or light or friend. And as one official put it, even if we did catch them and prosecute them, no Cornish jury would ever find them guilty. Some officers chose to turn a blind eye to the illegal traffic. In Mousehole, contraband was moved around quite openly during the day, and the local exciseman was eventually charged with accepting bribes and cooperating with the smugglers. For those smugglers that were apprehended and found guilty, the penalties were severe. A sentence of transportation to Australia was common, and Robert Lang from Veryan is one of a number who were publicly hanged as an example to others. But rather than act as a deterrent, the punishments made the smugglers more determined to avoid capture. The revenue officers in Foy go in danger of their lives if they try to seize the goods, the smugglers having entered into a pact to rescue any person who shall be arrested. And any law-abiding citizen who chose to alert the authorities to the clandestine activities of their neighbour would be ostracised and humiliated, as a report in the West Briton in January 1840 reveals. On Wednesday evening last, a mob assembled in the street at Tregony with bundles of reeds and faggots of wood in order to burn the effigy of Mrs. Rundle, who has been accused of giving information against Fugla, the person who has been committed to prison for 6 months for having been detected with a keg of contraband spirits in his van. But it wasn't the customs men or informers that eventually put paid to the smuggling trade. It was basic economics. A reduction in import duties in the 1850s meant that it was no longer profitable, and this colourful period in Cornwall's history passed into local folklore. There is, though, one legacy of smuggling that has survived. One of the bodies set up by the government to combat the trade was the Preventative Water Guard, established in 1809. By 1824, it had evolved into Her Majesty's Coast Guard Service, and in 1829 its responsibilities were extended to saving lives in the event of a shipwreck. Today, the Coast Guard Service is responsible for coordinating all civilian maritime search and rescue operations in the UK. In these missions, the Coast Guard is regularly assisted by the volunteers of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. Since its formation in 1824, the RNLI has saved more than 140,000 lives. Cornwall's first lifeboat was stationed at Penzance, but difficulties in launching it saw it moved in 1908 to Newlyn. Here it was kept under tarpaulin next to the harbour until a new boathouse was constructed at Penlee Point, south of Newlyn on the outskirts of Mousehole. The Solomon Brown, a wooden 47-foot lifeboat built in 1960 was stationed at Penlee for 21 years until, on the 19th of December 1981, it was called to the aid of the Union Star, whose engines had failed 8 miles east of the Wolf Rock Lighthouse to the southwest of Cornwall. The weather conditions were amongst the worst ever seen, with winds at hurricane force 12, gusts of up to 95 miles per hour, and waves about 60 feet tall. A helicopter had been unable to make a rescue, and the Solomon Brown's skipper, Coxswain Trevelyan Richards, made several attempts to get alongside the stricken cargo ship. Eventually he got close enough for 4 people to jump from the Union Star's wheelhouse onto the lifeboat. The lifeboat made a further attempt to rescue the remaining 4 when radio contact was lost. 10 minutes later, her lights disappeared. The lifeboat had been completely wrecked, with the loss of her crew of 8. Commander Smith, the pilot of the rescue helicopter, summed up the bravery of the Solomon Brown's crew. The greatest act of courage I have ever seen, and am ever likely to see, was the courage and dedication shown by the Penlee crew when it manoeuvred back alongside the casualty in over 60-foot breakers and rescued 4 people. They were truly the bravest men I have ever seen. That night, the tiny community of Mosul mourned the loss of 8 brave men. But just 2 days later, an entire new crew of volunteers had come forward. They included 17-year-old Neil Brockman, whose father had died on the Solomon Brown. Neil Brockman had turned up for duty on the night of the Union Star disaster, but was turned down for the trip by Trevelyan Richards, who was reluctant to take out 2 members of the same family in such dangerous seas. Coxswain Trevelyan Richards was posthumously awarded the Royal National Lifeboat Institution's Gold Medal, while the remainder of the crew were awarded bronze medals. One of the heroes, Charlie Greenaw, had turned on the Christmas lights in Mosul just 2 nights before. After the disaster, the lights were switched off out of respect. But 3 days later, his widow Mary asked for them to be lit again. Mosul Christmas lights have since become a major attraction, but on the anniversary of the tragedy, they're turned off at 8 p.m. for an hour as an act of remembrance. St. Ives lifeboat is another with a remarkable tradition of bravery and tragedy. Since it was founded in 1840, it has saved more than 1,000 lives, received 55 awards for gallantry, and lost 7 crewmen in the course of their duty. The station seen here on the quay in the 1960s had served since 1911, but was replaced in 1993 with a new one at the landward end of West Pier. On June the 15th, 1938, the people of Falmouth turned out in force to bid farewell to a ship that was renowned throughout the seafaring world, the Cutty Sark. This rather grainy film captures her historic last voyage, and the Western Morning News describes the scene. The famous old clipper ship was moved from her last berth in Falmouth harbour alongside the breakwater and taken out by 2 Falmouth tugs, and then handed over to the care of the London tug Muria, which will tow her to Greenhithe. as the renowned vessel, victor of many a grim race from Australia, moved slowly from her berth, ships in the harbour dressed gaily to pay their last tribute and clamoured a terrific farewell. Never again will Falmouth have the signal honour of being the home of such a craft of unequalled perfection. The Cutty Sark's graceful lines and wonderful feats at sea have made her dear to the heart of everyone, and all Falmouth last night watched her go with regret. Cutty Sark was launched in 1869 for London shipmaster Jock Willis to fulfil his ambition to win the annual race to bring home the first of the new season's tea from China. She never quite achieved that feat, but under her most successful captain, Richard Woodgett, went on to acquire legendary status. On his first voyage in command in 1885, the ship sailed from England to Sydney in 77 days and returned in a record 73 days. The ship soon established herself as the fastest vessel on the route, and she dominated the wool trade for the next 10 years. In one famous incident in July 1889, the crack P&O steamship Britannia, doing 15 knots, was overhauled and passed by Cutty Sark, doing 17 knots. The crew of the Britannia could only look on in amazement. But as steamships got faster, the Cutty Sark's heyday passed, and in 1895 she was sold to a Portuguese company and renamed the Ferreira. In January 1922, fate intervened in the Cutty Sark's fortunes when a storm in the English Channel forced her Portuguese captain to put into Falmouth. William Dowman was a retired Falmouth skipper, and as soon as he clapped eyes on the Ferreira, alias Cutty Sark, he vowed to buy her. Initial negotiations failed and the ship returned to Portugal, but Dowman persevered. In 1923, he paid £3,750, and the ship returned to Falmouth, where she reverted to her original name and was restored to her former glory. Captain Dowman died in 1936, and his widow decided she was unable to maintain the ship at her own cost. Cutty Sark was given to Thames Nautical Training College at Greenhithe and left Falmouth in 1938, accompanied by cheers from well-wishers and hoots from vessels in the harbour. This was the last time she went to sea. Seafaring matters have shaped Cornwall's history over millennia, but more recent times have seen the growing importance of land transport. The River Tamar has always been the great divide between England and Cornwall, but on the 2nd of May 1859 the barrier became considerably less formidable when Prince Albert opened the Tamar Railway Bridge, officially known as the Royal Albert Bridge. Thousands of spectators attended the opening ceremony, although things didn't quite go to plan. Illness prevented its designer, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, from attending, and guests from Cornwall were late because their train broke down at Liskeard. Even so, the bridge became an icon of a new age and an imposing symbol of the transition from Devon to Cornwall. A Great Western Railway travel guide described it as an almost magic means of transporting travellers from a county which is unmistakably English to a duchy which is in every respect un-English. You shut your eyes going over the Saltash Bridge only to open them again on a foreign scene. Cornish folk, of course, saw it the other way round. Despite the razzmatazz surrounding its opening, the Tamar Bridge wasn't Cornwall's first railway viaduct. 10 years earlier, on the 29th of January 1849, a viaduct had been built across the Tranance Valley in Newquay to carry the Cornwall Minerals Railway. The first bridge was a timber structure on stone piers, which was replaced by the present masonry structure in 1939. This 1930s film is unique as it shows the original viaduct shortly before its demolition. Passenger trains were introduced on the Newquay line on the 20th of June 1876, and in an interview with the Western News, the chairman of the Newquay board, Mr. A. Richardson, explained the significance to the town. The opening of the new railway will very largely contribute to the welfare of Newquay, and when the beauties of the neighbourhood become known and people get to know that the line is open, we will have legions of visitors to view the charming scenery. It will be necessary to provide additional accommodation for those who visit the ancient port, and I have no doubt that in a short space of time the whole of our beautiful hills will be clothed with villas and other buildings requisite to make Newquay prominent among sea-bathing places. So the railway had arrived. The tourists were on their way, and a new age had dawned for Cornwall. Victorian holidaymakers were quick to discover the area's delights, and Mr. Richardson's prediction was rapidly becoming a reality. The first of the large hotels dominating the cliff tops were the Headland, the Atlantic, and the Pavilion. By the 1930s, the tiny fishing village that had developed around its medieval New Quay was a bustling hive of summertime activity, and well on its way to becoming Cornwall's premier resort. The huts lined up on the beach hark back to an earlier time when it was improper for young ladies to be seen in their bathing suits by strange men. By now, the motorcar had become a common sight in Cornwall's burgeoning holiday destinations. Until the 1960s, though, it was still the railway that bore most visitors to Cornwall, and a century after the opening of the Tamar Rail Bridge, John Betjeman summed up its impact on the traveller. The general grey slate and back gardens of Plymouth, as seen from the Great Western, made the surprise of Saltash Bridge all the more exciting. Up and down stream, grey battleships were moored in the Tamar and its reaches. Hundreds of feet below, the pathetic steam ferry to Saltash from the Devon bank tried to compete with Brunel's mighty bridge. The ferry that Betjeman disparagingly dismissed had in fact served the communities either side of the Tamar for centuries, and it wasn't the railway bridge, but the road bridge that eventually brought about its demise. Its final crossing took place on the 23rd of October 1961, as the Morning News recalls. As the ferry chugged slowly across, her bell tolled several times. Her light moved away into the darkness for the last time under the shadow of the Tamar Road Bridge, which replaces her. A new transport revolution was gathering pace.
Trailers for sale or rent, rooms to let 50 cents. No phone, no pool, no pets. Ain't got no cigarettes, but 2 hours of pushing broom buys an 8, 12, 4-bedroom. I'm a man of means, by no means king of the road.
The age of mass car ownership would change our lives almost beyond recognition and bring tourists flocking to every nook and cranny of Cornwall. Most people came here to enjoy the fantastic beaches and dramatic coastline, Cornwall's prehistoric history. Its unique culture and its age-old seafaring traditions also became visitor attractions. then there were the carnivals and festivals. Few places in Britain can match Cornwall for keeping alive its ancient customs with such enthusiasm. There are two events in particular that stand out. Every year, on May the 8th, thousands of people throng the streets of Helston for the famous Furry Dance festivities. The origins of the dance are lost in the mists of time, but predate Christianity and are connected to pagan festivities to celebrate the coming of spring. The town is decked out with flowers and greenery, and locals, expats from all over the world and visitors alike join in the riot of colour, music and high spirits.
Dean de Warburn, Heddiw Agan Dea Arbenig the Hellis, Ni Istin Welcome de Cernoion, Ha Debuk Kendero Diwor, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States, Ho Kian Pile Tinaga Voa Dramor, Hinweith Welcome Dagan Kendero Bretonic, Ha Ruskion, Ha and Sorsen, and the Hal and Halantau at Ballet.
The May celebrations in Helston are rivaled only by the riotous May Day festivities each year in Padstow. May Day, or Obios Day as it's known, is the biggest event in Padstow's calendar. It's not unusual to see 30,000 people crammed into this little town on the day when Padstonians from all over the world return to their roots. The origins of the Obios are numerous. Some say the celebration has its roots in pagan times, others that it's a rain-making ceremony, a fertility symbol, a deterrent to a possible landing by the French some centuries ago, or simply a welcome to the summer. Whatever the origins of the Obios custom, it's impossible not to get caught up in the unique atmosphere. Locals spend the night decorating the town with flags, flowers and vegetation, complete with a maypole, and the following morning 2 osses, one red and one blue, emerge from their stables. The accompanying retinue are dressed in white and adorned with sprays of cowslips and bluebells, and blue or red ribbons showing which oss they follow, dictated by family loyalty going back generations. The osses, swirling and capering, proceed through the streets taunted by a teaser who leads the dance with theatrical movements to the sound of musicians and drummers and young and old joining in the traditional May song.